This is the Closure House, where we discuss boundaries, estrangement, no contact, and the hard conversation about relationships that many people avoid. I'm Jessica, I'm your host, and today we're going to be discussing what happens when the scapegoat actually leaves the family dynamic. So, this won't be the family's version of somebody being entitled or ungrateful. This will be what actually happens psychologically when a person says enough is enough and they no longer want to be a part of their family. So, let's start here. What is a scapegoat? Well, they're the person in the family who gets blamed for the dysfunction and the chaos. And the reason why they get blamed is because they're the person who notices it. So they're the ones who point it out. And there is a family system and it's dysfunctional. So it's all running, even though it's not really a good situation or healthy for anybody. So what happens is everybody kind of has their role in their place. And they just continue throughout the family until somebody comes along and says, like, I don't really like what's happening and I don't think it's right. And because I don't think it's right, I'm going to point out what's happening and hopefully we'll get some change. Well, that person ends up getting scapegoated and they become the blame. So a lot of times someone who is a scapegoat gets blamed for the tension, they get blamed for being too sensitive, or they get labeled as the problem in the relationship. But the scapegoat's the one who notices things, they ask questions, and they start challenging the family to get some kind of change so that they can operate within the family because they're like, I cannot do this. But I think that what people don't understand is that when you're in a dysfunctional family, there are roles and like everybody has a role. It's a unconscious thing. It's not something that people get assigned. It's like there is a mascot, there is a golden child, right? There is a caretaker. There's all these roles in families where people just do whatever in their role, and it actually keeps the dysfunction going. So when the scapegoat comes along, they disrupt that role because they're like, well, wait a minute. I'm seeing abuse or I'm seeing mistreatment or I'm seeing something that's unfair. And because they bring it to light, they become the target for the family. And many times the scapegoat is not like the difficult person in the family as much as they're just not the quiet ones. They see the dysfunction, they point it out, they're hoping for change. But instead of it becoming like this enlightening for the family, it becomes a situation where the scapegoat gets attacked. They become the problem and they get targeted by the family and mistreated. So if you're wondering, like, how does somebody become a scapegoat? Usually they're the ones who start doing the healing. Like they start realizing something's going wrong and like, I got to fix myself. So they like go to therapy or they start seeking out help because they're like, what is going on? Like my family is going through all these things and it seems like everybody's okay with everything that's happening in the family. And so the scapegoat's like, I don't really want to deal with that. So they start seeking out help, either reading books, going to therapy, or talking to people, anything that they can do to try to figure out like what's happening. Why am I the only one that's noticing? And I always compare it to like, it's like a house on fire and you're telling everybody in the family, oh my goodness, the house is on fire. But everybody's operating like normal, like nothing ever happened. Like they don't notice the house is on fire. And that's really frustrating because it almost makes you feel crazy. You're like, well, why is nobody else noticing this? And the reason is because that's the dysfunctional family and that's the state the family wants to stay in. So everybody else plays their role. But the scapegoat struggles to kind of fall in line because they want the family to be better, to be healthy, to be different. So a lot of times it's like the person who woke up. And as they're pointing out the dysfunction and everything, they're really hoping for change. But they get tired of defending themselves and they get tired of being the brunt of jokes. They get tired of being put down, like often having to apologize or be told that they're wrong or get put into situations they weren't even a part of. So many times the scapegoat leaves the family dynamic. When you're the one who always gets blamed for everything, you either learn to shrink or you learn how to start asking why. And once you start asking why, the dynamic starts changing. So when people come into therapy many times and they're having like family issues, they talk about how like they'll go to their family for Christmas or Thanksgiving or something. And the whole time that they're there, they're being mistreated, talked about, put down, ridiculed, embarrassed. And because of that, they decide they don't want to be a part of it. Like specifically, they will shrink so that they're like, okay, let me just try to come in here and not say anything and I will not rock the boat. Or they may try to just defend themselves, and then they get told they're too sensitive or they're too dramatic. Like they're constantly told that they're not who they actually are, but that's kind of how the family sees them. They see them as this problem. So before the scapegoat actually leaves the family, though, they usually try to talk to people, to set boundaries and everything. So a specific situation that sticks out is like a girl who's going to her family for the holidays. And before she goes, she's like, okay, I'm going to make sure I wear something I'm comfortable in. I'm going to make sure that if somebody says this, I don't cry or I don't challenge it. Like if I get ridiculed, if they put me down, like she's doing all this defensive work to make sure that she's safe when she goes to see her family. But traditionally, the family usually puts her down, calls her names, talks about embarrassing things, a lot of ridicule that she's like, okay, I'm preparing myself for the ridicule and I don't want to be too big in the space where everybody's talking about me and putting me down. So I'm just going to shrink. So I've heard people in this space say they like go to their families and they pretend they're sick, or they go to their families. They're like, oh, I got a headache. I can't really, engage. And no matter how they show up, they get the same result. And that is where people are like, I don't want to do this anymore. So in this specific situation, she goes to her family's house. She's talking with everyone. People are making jokes. Then when she says, I don't really want to be talked to like that, which is a boundary, then people are like, oh, you're so dramatic. You're so sensitive. You can't take a joke. And for her, she was just decided, I don't want to deal with this anymore. So she walked away. And that's the exposure that I'm talking about when it comes to scapegoats. A scapegoat can't sit there and be abused by people, mistreated, in unhealthy dynamics and sit there. They are like, no, this is not right. This doesn't feel right. And in the process of that, a lot of times there's a smear campaign. And then people from the family come in and they start talking about that person. Oh my goodness, did you see this person? She thinks she's too good. She thinks she's too smart. She thinks she's better than everyone, or she's changed. And the family kind of all goes with it and attacks this one person because that person is a scapegoat. Or you'll see things like you'll hear about words like triangulation, where somebody will talk about one other person and they'll put them down, and the scapegoat gets wrapped up into the triangulation of the situation. And if that's not what's happening, then it'll be guilt. And then somebody will say, why aren't you talking to your nephew? Why aren't you talking to your mom? Why aren't you talking to your dad, your cousin, your aunt, whoever? And the scapegoat is like, I want to talk to them, but they are so toxic or they are so unhealthy that I can't talk to them. And then all of a sudden, all these other narratives start emerging, and people start thinking, oh, well, after everything I've done for you, after everything I've given you, after all the things, X, Y, and Z. And the person feels guilted. So a lot of times before a scapegoat goes no contact, they have tried a lot of different things. But I think where the change comes in is when they enter into therapy or get like a really good friend group or start paying attention to other people's dynamics, they start seeing, oh my goodness, this really was unhealthy. This wasn't me being crazy. So they walk away. And there's a lot of loneliness that comes with walking away, but sometimes people feel that is the only way that I can deal with life is if I don't have people ridiculing me and putting me down. So the difference is because I know that there are difficult people and there are people who start drama everywhere. They constantly make arguments or create like gossip or problems and difficulty. I'm not talking about that. That person is not a scapegoat. That person is creating problems. If you want to look at it a different way, a scapegoat is a person who has problems even when they're not creating them. So they are just existing in this dysfunctional family system. And while they're existing, there's a problem. I brought up grief because even when you're walking away, grief can be so isolating. There's still grief associated anytime you lose anything. And a lot of times when people enter into therapy in this space, they're like, I'm just a problem. Like, I'm a problem for everybody. I'm no good. And when we break down what they've been through, what they're going through, what's happening, a lot of times it sounds like they're the person, because the scapegoat usually is. They are the person that seeks out the help. So when they come into therapy, they start seeing patterns and working through issues and seeing where there were problems, what their contribution was, how they got accused of things they weren't even a part of and became the blame. And a lot of times that gives them some relief to say, this family is still having problems without me. Even when I'm not a part of the problem, I'm just not a part of the conversation directly anymore when I actually go completely no contact. What I've learned in my own, it's not just grieving the people. You're grieving the hope that someday they'll even see you differently. And I think that's how most people get to the point where they're like, forget those people. I don't care about those people. I'm not going to be a part of this family and I'm not going to care anymore because after a while, you notice they have the same problems even when I'm not present. So was I really the problem? So one thing that I really show up. So one thing that I really see show up is guilt. People feel guilty. They feel guilty for leaving. They feel guilty for needing something else, but they're just like, I can't do it. And when you grow up in a conditioned environment to endure abuse and everything like that, you feel guilty because loyalty is the biggest part. It's like, you can't leave this family. You have to stay. This is what we do. And I think that when it comes to being the scapegoat, people just don't want to do it. Then I see people start internalizing it and they're like, well, maybe I was the problem. And once you go to therapy, you start processing those things and you're like, well, wait a minute. I didn't do this or I didn't do that or they saw me this way or accused me of this. But I think the biggest takeaway is like, you're not responsible for managing everybody's emotions. It is not one person in the family's job to deal with every dysfunctional thing, point it out, try to create change. Like people have to want to change. And if you realize that they don't and you can't be the person you want to be in that space, a lot of times the only way to get out is to walk away. I see this all the time in relationships where there's physical abuse. Like there is a uncle or a grandfather or somebody who's physically abusing children. And so somebody will point it out to say, hey, this happened to me. This is what I experienced. And the family will tell them that's not what they experienced. They're lying and the person feels isolated and they feel like, well, maybe I am the problem. Maybe I'm the reason why the family's broken up. It's not the person who created the abuse or did that. It's the person who's bringing up the abuse that gets isolated and ridiculed and left out. That's why being a scapegoat is so difficult because if you're that role in your family, you become that role in a lot of other people's lives too, because you constantly are the truth teller. You're the person who's noticing dysfunction everywhere. And when you bring it up, it's all for the sake of saving relationships or wanting a better experience or to be healthy. But it almost always gets met with resistance because people don't want to change. So they don't want that healthy dynamic. And because of that, the person gets scapegoated even in friendships. So they may get scapegoated at work. It's like it becomes this trend. So it makes it really hard for us as therapists to come in and say, hey, you're not the problem when every space they're having problems. So like I know when I was growing up, we were always taught if you have a problem with everybody, you're the problem. That's it. But what I've learned over time is like, if you have a problem with everybody and you're not creating problems, you're probably the scapegoat. When it comes to healing, though, it gets down to boundaries. So people start setting boundaries and remember your boundaries are for you. So we've talked previously on podcasts with experts and they've said, when you are creating boundaries, they have to start with I. So a boundary is not, don't talk to me like that. That is a demand. A boundary is not, if you talk to me like that again, I'm never going to talk to you. Right? That's more of an ultimatum. When we're talking about setting boundaries, it's like, I don't want to be talked to that way, or I won't be talked to that way. Like all the statements start with I. So when you go into your families and you're setting these boundaries and people are pushing back, a lot of times, like I said, people will exit the family. But when it comes to boundary setting, that's usually the first step. And once people get through boundary setting, seeking out their own help, reading, therapy, whatever, and they don't get the result they want, that's when I see them exit. Healing isn't trying to prove that you're right. Because if you get into that, you're really going to feel crazy because your whole family is going to be like defending each other and you're going to be the odd man out and it's going to feel like you're crazy. It can't be about trying to make them understand where you're coming from, too. I think that you can start there, but once you see that that's not happening, then you're going to have to make a decision. Some people will deal with the dysfunction and just stay just for the sake of family. And other people will be like, I cannot for the sake of saving myself. So you don't need to defend yourself. You don't need to over-explain. And you don't need to shrink. And when you step out of that scapegoat role, you start learning who you are without the label. And trust me, that takes time, especially when you've been told you've been the problem for years. It takes a long time to undo that narrative. So I always tell people, however old you are is how long it took you to get mindsets, all the conditioning. If you want to undo thinking, you have to be intentional. You have to be talking to yourself in a positive way, and you have to avoid relationships where you are getting scapegoated if you want to get healthy. If you were the scapegoat and you walked away, understand this. I know it's comfortable, but that doesn't mean that you were the problem. And it doesn't mean you were wrong, but it does mean that you disrupted a pattern. And that pattern depended on you. Choosing peace doesn't make you wrong. It makes you honest. This is the Closure House. And in this house, we don't shrink to stay connected.